Video game movies are extremely popular nowadays, and this is plain to see. Audiences flock to movie theaters to check out these entries, which are often based on popular intellectual properties and adaptations within the specific space. The reason for this is more than apparent. If so-called gamers love the fantastical worlds on display within these video game entries, it stands to reason that they would then further enjoy jumping back into these settings within cinematic adaptations. Indeed, it seems this cross-section of media disciplines has paved the way for box office phenomena within recent years alone. I mean, look what happened with the Super Mario Bros. Movie, for example. However, an interesting subset of the central conversation, and one that continues to rear its head whenever I personally contemplate these specific films is, will audiences who are not familiar with these video game properties actually enjoy these movies for what they are? After all, fans of these games might be satiated with blatant references and plot points pulled from these installments, but what about someone who is going into these experiences headfirst with no prior knowledge whatsoever or recollection of what they should ultimately expect? And while I find that some examples within this space are able to do just this, broaching their subject matter in a way that can enthrall and appease veterans and newcomers alike, there are often video game-based movies that feel like they seclude themselves from the audience viewpoint and close themselves off from an external analysis, instead catering to a specific facet of fans and never allowing anyone else in on the central experience. And this is precisely the feeling I had with 2023's adaptation of the smash hit indie horror game Five Nights at Freddy's. Now, to add further context to my standpoint in relation to this franchise before I begin this review, I have to make it clear that I actually grew up playing Five Nights at Freddy's quite extensively, as a matter of fact. You all probably remember those middle school discussions at the lunch tables where yourself and your friends would pour and converse over whatever hot topic was being passed around the classrooms and hallways of your school. And for a moment, there was a specific time back in the day where myself and my friends were all obsessed with Five Nights at Freddy's. It was honestly clear to see why, even outside the personal context I bring to this story in this franchise. FNAF, as it's commonly termed, and I will be referring to the film as in this review, is a franchise that innovated independent and niche horror within the video game community, and that much is apparent. What started off as a simple premise involving a security guard working overnight at a haunted Chuck E. Cheese type establishment soon turned into a complex and enthralling franchise seeped deep into lore and overarching storylines that flesh out the complexities of this world tenfold. Indeed, I honestly fondly remember sitting with my dad's iPad on sunny afternoons as a kid playing FNAF and seeking to beat out a clock in the animatronics in order to survive. Although looking back on it now, I'm never actually sure I made it even past the fourth night, if I'm going to be honest with you. However, although I did indeed play the game and I am no doubt familiar with the franchise itself to an extent, it does have to be stated that FNAF is a series that has continued to grow and evolve over the years, extending lore and adding further complexities to the plot that even I have not kept up on at all. And this is why with 2023's film adaptation, I hoped that the story itself would have been able to stand not only apart and succeed as a standalone film, but also extend and flesh out this world for audiences who might not be familiar with this franchise itself. And to say I had more than my fair share of problems with the first FNAF movie is an understatement, as I blatantly hated more than an abundance of elements within that specific film. Although I sparred vehemently with fans of the film who claimed critics just, quote, didn't get it, I was always somewhat let down by that film from a fan-specific context as well. As someone who grew up with this series and this franchise, I ultimately want FNAF to succeed, which is why it's so disappointing when the execution here doesn't allow the property to express itself in any meaningful way. So, to say that I brought anything blatant in the way of expectation to the follow-up Five Nights at Freddy's 2, which released in theaters this past weekend, would be an understatement. Now, contrary to popular belief, I did not approach this installment hoping that this film would be lackluster in any single way. After all, I never go into a film wanting it to be bad, but I rather hope that the filmmakers and talent behind it will prove me wrong and provide something of substance to be found in the runtime. And this was especially true here after I didn't care for the first installment whatsoever. I wanted this film to be an improvement from the first in every single way. However, it was tough to feel this way given some of the director Emma Tammy's comments before the film released, which I do want to highlight and kind of focus on here for a minute. In a recent interview before the film's release, Tammy was reportedly quoted by saying, "Critics are not who we're listening to for this franchise. I think it's dangerous to listen to critics in general, even if they're saying stuff that you don't disagree with. The sequel is for the fans, we've been listening to what everyone wanted, and I think we've got a lot of surprises up our sleeves that everyone will be excited about." Now, the moment I first heard and read this quote, my immediate reaction to it was, this cannot bode well for the movie itself. After all, if a legitimate filmmaker behind a movie is coming out ahead of the movie's release and blatantly saying that a movie cannot be judged fairly by by critics, who are we to even expect something in the way of substance here whatsoever? However, for myself personally, as a working critic and entertainment reporter who strives to bring fair and honest coverage and analysis of film and media to my audience, I took offense to many of the assumptions that Tammy makes about the criticism art form here. While it's true that some critics nowadays are not capable of nuance within their work and seem to fall into that echo-based internet chamber of hating on film and media when it doesn't fit in their specific category of quote-unquote good, I do think it's pretty disingenuous on the part of an actual artist in the industry to not recognize the power and truth that criticism can hold in regards to film and movie properties themselves. One of the greatest parts of this career field is when I'm able to share analysis of an art piece that truly worked or connected with me in general. Granted, I completely understand every time I post a review that what I find personally good might not be everyone's cup of tea, and even vice versa as well, but here's the thing. That's okay. Part of the power of good art is the discussion it can broach across all areas. And this is truthfully one of the most redeeming parts of this profession. So for a filmmaker to actually come out and say that critics shouldn't be taken seriously in their analysis of this work is disappointing to say the least. Especially for those of us in the industry who strive to give all film projects a fair chance, and who seek to balance reviews with uplifting points of interest over overt negativity and criticism. So just like I always do in my work, I approach FNAF 2 with an open mind. Hesitant due to my disinterest in the first installment, but looking forward to seeing what this franchise has in store for a sequel that is going to be highly anticipated in the current box office landscape. And unfortunately, while this review of FNAF 2 will be more negative in tone, this is not to say that the film in general does not have specific points of interest that show promise and opportunity within the horror space itself. In fact, the exact opposite of this is in fact true when discussing and analyzing this specific movie. You see, FNAF 2 is a film that is a clear step above the messy first installment, both in terms of execution and premise itself. I personally found the story so much more engaging this time around, the character arcs feel a little bit more nuanced, and the horror-based elements managed to cut incredibly deep here, with some tension and rampant paranoia instilled within several moments of this film with ease. However, the unfortunate truth of these points is how FNAF 2 is a movie that clearly shows promise, but cannot ultimately manage to live up to the same end product that many people might expect from this film. FNAF 2 picks up shortly after the events of the first film, where security guard Mike Schmidt, played by Josh Hutcherson, and his sister Abby, played by Piper Rubio, are still grappling with the horrifying events that happened at Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria, which mainly consisted of possessed animatronics coming to life and wanting Abby to join them in their eternal afterlife. However, with the continued yet mysterious presence of Vanessa, played by Elizabeth Lyle, who seems to know more about the animatronics than she lets on, both Mike and Abby will have to fight to survive as more animatronics from a sister location of the chain pizzeria come to life with a vengeance. And this time, they're stepping foot outside the confines of their building itself. Obviously, there's a lot more to the core central plot here than I'm letting on in my brief plot synopsis, but I do want to save many of the surprises for those fans who might want to go into this one blind and are watching this video. When discussing the core of this film in particular, I have to at least commend Josh Hutcherson again here, who continues to deliver the right amount of nuance and camp within his role as Mike Schmidt here. This would be a specific role and character where many other performers simply wouldn't know whether to play the character seriously or over the top. But the greatest thing about Hutcherson here is how he strikes a careful balance right down the middle. His performance commands the material here, but also allows for moments of levity and lighthearted fun that allow audiences to examine the material from an external viewpoint itself. This is also clearly exemplified within the core relationship with Abby, played once again in a great performance from Piper Rubio. Mike and Abby's core dynamic drives a lot of the dramatic stakes within this film in particular. And here, in comparison to the first film, their relationship feels further fleshed out and contextualized with the confines of this horror-based structure. What I loved about this entry in comparison to the first is how you truly feel for and relate to these characters, and their dynamic as well, which further makes the stakes more present and prevalent all the same. Unfortunately, however, I cannot say the same about the dynamic between Elizabeth and William Afton, played respectively by Elizabeth Lyle and Matthew Lillard. While I commend what they're doing with these characters within their performances, their relationship within the film is never properly explained or contextualized in order to allow audiences a viewpoint into their rampant dramatic stakes or why we should ultimately care about this situation. However, it's truly McKenna Grace who stole the show from me here within a small little part here, which allows her the freedom and opportunity to go all into her role here with feverish intensity and delight. It is so much fun watching Grace clearly having a blast with material here, and it's a role where the performer's enjoyment is further contextualized for the audience themselves. As mentioned, another element I truly loved and appreciated about FNAF 2 is how this actually feels like a horror movie in every sense of the word. One of my main issues with the first installment was that for a horror movie, nothing felt grounded or anxiety-ridden in general, and instead treated the material as an over-the-top parody of itself within the horror genre. Yet here, nothing about this feels restrained in the slightest, and this is clearly evident even within the opening scene itself, which sets the tone for the intensity within the rest of the project's runtime with ease. Everything and everyone here is fair game, which makes this stakes and overall tone feel so much more confined and claustrophobic as a result. If there is one thing to be said about this film in general, it's that director Emma Tammy clearly has a distinct vision within the film itself. And there are so many good moments here from a choreography and shot composition standpoint. So many of the set pieces and moments here truly elevate the material beyond what you might expect from traditional PG-13 horror. However, as I mentioned towards the beginning of this review, the unfortunate truth of a film like FNAF 2 is how these moments of promise are interjected by material that is just not great, to put it lightly. If we're talking about this movie, we have to talk about the seriously baffling screenplay on display here. This movie was written entirely by Scott Cawthon, who was actually the creator of the original games within this series. As a result, many prospective audience members might therefore expect the material here to feel elevated, allowing Cawthon to expand upon his game's lore and storylines in a way that broaches enjoyment for new and old audience members alike. However, this could be further from the case even if it tried. And it genuinely pains me to say that this is quite possibly one of the weakest screenplays I've seen all year so far, and I do not say that lightly at all. Perhaps the most frustrating element of a film like FNAF 2 is how so much of this clearly shows insight and nuance into the core game material itself, with perspective moments and ideas that seem intense and prevalent on paper and ripe for great cinematic execution in the film. However, there seems to be almost a disconnect between how Cawthon envisions these moments on paper and how Tammy and company adapt them to the silver screen, leading to moments where the bombastic and grandiose horror-based moments that are supposed to instill dread and tension into the audience sort of fizzle out instead. The central plot of this film feels messy and unrefined, with so many ideas struggling for air all at once and never forming a cohesive narrative that audiences can follow throughout. It's a movie that feels like it jumps from place to place with absolutely no warning whatsoever, almost giving audiences thematic whiplash in the process. To be fair, however, FNAF 2 has given itself a distinctly difficult job, which is fitting incredible amounts of lore and material into its comparatively tiny package. Unfortunately, however, the way the overall story was conveyed here feels messy and self-indulgent, and really begs into question who the material was ultimately made for. Alas, many of the best moments from FNAF 2's runtime are when it embraces its intense, but also darkly comedic and campy atmosphere, blending the two together almost like a cinematic peanut butter cup. However, the worst part about this film by far, and the reason my rating and analysis of the piece were intensified and lowered by equal measure, is how the third act evolves into what could be best described as messy cinematic fodder of the highest order. The third act is a portion of the film that seems to sacrifice whatever thematic goodwill and intent the film had up to that point, in favor of something that seems to want to capitalize off of the one thing holding this franchise together: fan service. And look, fan service is something I come to know and expect from films of this caliber. There is absolutely nothing wrong with a film blatantly appealing to fans with a grandiose spectacle or a sequence. However, my issue with the third act here has nothing to do with the intent of these moments, but rather the execution. The film completely gives up the grounded and intense horror-based and unrelenting atmosphere of the entire film up to that point, in favor of a conclusion that could best be described as almost Marvel-like in a sense, although I hate to use that term lightly, where the entire intent and purpose of the sequence seems less focused on telling a cohesive narrative and more focused on allowing audiences to cheer and clap and yell at carefully manufactured moments within the runtime itself. And ultimately, this is further accentuated by the baffling ending of the film, which is quite possibly the worst conclusion to a theatrical motion picture release I have potentially ever seen before in my lifetime. The film, if you didn't know, ends on a distinct cliffhanger, which promises a future installment to expand upon and continue the events of this film forward. However, unlike most cliffhangers that manage to pull this off in a satisfying or nuanced way that feels conclusive but ever hopeful at the same time, here the most baffling and maniacal thing about this ending is how it feels so abrupt and jarring with equal measure. All I'll say is that when the screen cut to black and the end credits started to roll at the end of this movie, I genuinely thought to myself that it was a joke and the movie still had more time to go in the runtime. But alas, that could have been further from the truth here. I really just want some creative insight into many of the choices made here, because this film's conclusion seems less like a feature film and more like audiences just binge watched a Netflix original series and are going to start the next episode momentarily. But when the next film hasn't even been greenlit or even started production yet, and this is a legitimate movie you've paid money to see inside of a theatrical setting, it's possible that audiences might feel slightly cheated out of the overall execution here. Overall, to say that FNAF 2 is entirely what I expected is honestly inaccurate. It is better than the previous installment by far, and as a franchise addition, it managed to actually capture a darker and more intense tone that feels more in line with the original game's unrelenting atmosphere. However, is this enough to win over or satiate most audiences? Not particularly, especially when calling into question the film's subpar screenplay and baffling thematic structure. It's fine for the fans, but the impact stops at the door for everyone else. Kind of like the animatronics themselves do in the film when they try to step foot outside the pizzeria. That's why I'm giving Five Nights at Freddy's 2 a 2 out of 5 stars. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching this review on my channel. If you're new around here and you like the content you see, don't forget to click that subscribe button down below, like the video, and turn on push notifications. Also, leave comment suggestions down below for future video, essay, and review topics. With that being said, until next time, this is Mitchell signing off. Peace out.